Welcome to Sleeping Times. Have you ever wondered how messages traveled before the internet? Imagine a world without emails, without instant messages, where every piece of news took days, weeks, or even months to reach its destination. How did people communicate? What challenges did they face? And how did those early forms of communication shape the world we live in today? Throughout this video, we'll explore the fascinating evolutions of human communication, from horseback couriers to the advent of the telegraph. Each chapter will reveal the difficulties faced in different eras and draw intriguing parallels with the present day. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see how our community is spread around the world. Now, how about turning off the lights, finding a comfortable position, and getting ready for a relaxing journey through the history of communication? Relax and join us on this voyage through time, discovering how humanity's need to connect has overcome unimaginable barriers. In the silent depths of the Lascaux caves more than 17,000 years ago, human hands worked by the unsteady light of flickering torches, creating the first deliberate attempts at enduring communication. Red pigment, laboriously extracted from iron oxides, was mixed with animal fat to form a primitive paint that would cling to rock walls for millennia. Each stroke was a conscious decision, each figure an effort to transcend the present moment and speak to the future. Imagine the monumental challenge of conveying something complex using only images. How could one explain that a particular trail led to a source of clean water? How could one warn about the dangers of a specific region? Cave artists developed a sophisticated visual vocabulary in which an animal's position, the relative size of figures, and even the choice of cave wall carried specific meanings. It was a language that demanded physical presence. You had to be there, in that exact place, to receive the message. The fragility of this form of communication was obvious. A flood could erase vital information forever. A rockfall would wipe out decades of accumulated knowledge. Worse still, interpretation depended entirely on shared cultural knowledge. A tribe arriving at that cave 100 years later might see only decorative drawings where once there had been detailed survival instructions. Time was another relentless enemy. Unlike our instant messages that span the globe in fractions of a second, these visual communications were static, bound to time and place. There was no way to update information, correct an error, or add new details. Once the paint dried on the rock, the message was sealed for eternity, with all its imperfections and limitations. For more immediate communications, our ancestors developed smoke signals, dark columns rising against the blue sky, carrying encoded messages across vast distances. The process was laborious. First, one had to build a fire at the highest available spot, then feed it with specific materials that produced the desired smoke density. Green leaves created thick white smoke, while dry wood produced darker, more defined plumes. But the elements were constant adversaries. A strong wind could scatter the smoke before it formed recognizable patterns. Rain snuffed out the flames at the most crucial moment. Morning fog made it impossible to distinguish smoke signals from low clouds. And at night, this method simply ceased to exist, leaving entire communities isolated in the dark. The complexity of the codes also posed significant challenges. How many puffs of smoke meant danger? Did 3 quick columns followed by a long one signal help needed, or all good? Different tribes developed incompatible systems, creating an atmospheric Tower of Babel where crucial messages were lost in mistranslation. A signal of peace from one culture could be read as a declaration of war by another. The reliance on perfect weather made smoke signal communication deeply unreliable. Imagine the anxiety of a community waiting for confirmation that their messengers had safely reached their destination, only to see the sky blanketed with clouds for consecutive days. Uncertainty was a constant companion, and silence did not always mean peace. It could signal tragedy, misunderstanding, or simply bad weather. Today, when we complain about a slow internet connection or a message that takes a few seconds to deliver, we rarely consider that our ancestors could wait days or weeks for a simple confirmation. They developed a patience our digital age has lost, but they also lived with a level of uncertainty we would find unbearable. Has our instant communication made us more connected or simply more impatient? As the earliest attempts at human communication struggled against the limits of time and space, a quiet revolution was taking shape. Across the vast plains where nomadic tribes followed the migrations of animals, a new kind of messenger was being trained, no longer dependent on campfires or cave walls, but on something far faster and more reliable: human legs themselves. At the first light of dawn, when dew still kissed the tall grass of the plains, a solitary figure emerged from the morning mist. He was a messenger, recognizable by his upright posture, controlled breathing, and leg muscles forged by years of rigorous training. His bare feet knew every kind of terrain: the rough texture of volcanic rock, the treacherous softness of marshes, the reassuring firmness of trails packed by the constant passage of other runners. The training of these messengers began in childhood. Children 5 or 6 years old were selected not only for speed, but for memorization skills and mental fortitude. They learned to run in different weather conditions, to navigate by the stars, to identify edible plants and sources of clean water. More importantly, they developed a near supernatural memory, capable of retaining complex messages word for word, even after days of grueling running. The responsibility they bore was crushing. A misdelivered message could result in war between tribes, the death of innocents, or the collapse of vital alliances. These runners did not carry mere words, they carried the fate of entire communities in their minds. The psychological pressure was immense, especially when they knew that lives depended on the speed and accuracy of their delivery. Physical dangers were constant and varied. Nocturnal predators lurked in the shadows, drawn by movement and human scent. Swollen rivers had to be crossed, even during floods, when the current could sweep the messenger far off course. Sudden storms turned familiar trails into treacherous labyrinths, where a single misstep could mean a fatal fall from a cliff invisible in the dark. Loneliness was perhaps the cruelest challenge. Days and nights running alone, accompanied only by the sound of one's own breathing and the hypnotic rhythm of feet striking the ground. Without company, the mind began to play tricks. Shadows turned into pursuers, the wind whispered non-existent threats, and extreme fatigue spawned hallucinations that could lead the messenger off his route. Many developed personal rituals, repetitive songs, mantras, or step counting to preserve mental sanity during the longest journeys. Message accuracy depended entirely on human memory, an inherently fallible system. After days of running, with the body exhausted and the mind dulled by fatigue, crucial details could be lost or distorted. A single misremembered word could completely alter the meaning of a diplomatic message. An incorrect number in military instructions could lead troops into a deadly ambush. The responsibility was terrifying, and many messengers developed elaborate mental rehearsal techniques to preserve the integrity of the information. Extreme weather tested the limits of human endurance. Under the blistering desert sun, dehydration became a race against time, finding water before the body collapsed. During snowstorms, hypothermia was a constant threat, and many messengers were found days later, frozen within a few kilometers of their destination. Torrential rains turned peaceful rivers into deadly torrents and mountain trails into cascades of mud. and loose stones. Speed, though crucial, had to be balanced with endurance. Running too fast at the start of the journey could result in premature exhaustion, leaving the messenger vulnerable to attacks or unable to complete the mission. Too slow and vital information might arrive too late to be useful. It was the cruel arithmetic of survival, where every decision about pacing and rest could determine the mission's success or failure. Today, when we send a message and it isn't delivered instantly, we feel frustration. But imagine carrying information that could save lives, knowing that every minute of delay increased the risk of tragedy. These messengers lived with a weight our digital communication has eliminated: the total physical and emotional responsibility for delivering information. Have we lost something essential when we remove the human element from communication? As civilizations grew and distances between settlements increased, it became clear that even the hardiest runners had limits. The need for speed and reliability led to the domestication of an animal that would forever revolutionize human communication, a creature whose speed, endurance, and loyalty would transform messengers from solitary runners into riders of the plains. The sound was unmistakable, the rhythmic drumming of hooves on hard-packed earth, swelling in intensity until it became a thunder that made the ground tremble beneath one's feet. When the first mounted messenger appeared on the horizon, his silhouette cut against the golden evening sky, humanity witnessed a revolution in the speed of communication. The horse, its powerful muscles rippling beneath sweat-slicked skin and flared nostrils venting steam into the cold morning air, was not merely a means of transport, it was the key to connecting distant worlds. The domestication of the horse radically transformed the logistics of communication. Where a foot messenger once took a week to cover 200 kilometers, a skilled rider could traverse the same distance in 2 days. But that speed came with previously unimaginable complexities. Horses required constant care, clean water every few hours, quality forage, adequate rest, and veterinary treatment when injured or ill. A poorly tended animal could collapse in the middle of a crucial mission, leaving the messenger on foot in hostile territory. The required training was now twofold. Both rider and horse had to develop an almost telepathic attunement. The animal had to learn to navigate rough terrain in the dark, to maintain a steady pace, even when startled, and to respond instantly to the rider's commands. The messenger, in turn, had to master not only horsemanship but also basic veterinary care, navigation, and the ability to make split-second decisions about when to push the pace and when to conserve the animal's energy. The infrastructure needed to support this system was formidable. Networks of way stations had to be established at regular intervals, each maintaining fresh horses, supplies, and trained personnel. These stations became vulnerable nodes, obvious targets for enemies intent on disrupting communications. Protecting them demanded soldiers, fortifications, and continuous resources. A successful attack on a single station could shatter a communication chain stretching hundreds of kilometers. The costs were astronomical by the standards of the time. A quality horse could cost the equivalent of a common worker's annual wages. Multiplied by the dozens or hundreds of animals required to keep a route active, along with feed, veterinary care, and the replacement of animals lost to injury or death, maintaining a mounted post system was within reach only of the wealthiest rulers or commercial organizations. This created a clear divide between those with access to rapid communication and those condemned to slower methods. Weather remained a formidable challenge, now amplified by the animal's vulnerability. Snowstorms could kill exposed horses in a matter of hours. Extreme heat brought rapid dehydration, especially for animals carrying the added weight of a rider and supplies. Torrential rains turned roads into quagmires where horses could break legs or become mired. Each season brought its own specific dangers, demanding constant adjustments to routes and methods. security became a greater concern. Mounted messengers were more visible and valuable targets, both for the information they carried and the horses they rode. Bandits developed tactics tailored to ambushing riders using traps, artificial obstacles, and coordinated strikes. Many messengers began traveling armed, becoming warriors as well as bearers of messages. This added weight, reduced speed, and required additional military training. Message interception became a military art. Enemies learned to identify postal routes, capture messengers, and extract information through torture or bribery. This drove the development of more sophisticated ciphers, decoy messages to mislead interceptors, and secret alternate routes. Communication became a complex chess game in which every move was anticipated and countered. Reliance on animals introduced an unpredictability that hadn't existed with human runners. Horses could fall ill, suddenly spook at predators, or simply refuse to continue. Unlike a human runner motivated by a sense of duty, an animal followed its own instincts. Many missions failed not because of human incompetence, but because of unforeseeable animal behavior. Today, when our internet goes down for a few minutes, we feel cut off from the world. But imagine depending on a living creature for vital communication, knowing that a storm, an illness, or a predator could sever your lifeline to the outside world. These systems created the first, truly rapid communication networks, but they also introduced vulnerabilities that our ancestors had to learn to manage. How does our current dependence on technology compare to their dependence on animals? As riders galloped along dusty roads carrying messages between distant cities, other observers noted that nature had already devised its own airborne postal service. Winged creatures capable of navigating impressive distances with a precision that defied human understanding were about to be enlisted for one of the most elegant forms of communication ever developed. In the hush of dawn, as the first golden light began to paint the horizon, a small metal cylinder was carefully tied to a homing pigeon's leg. The bird, its iridescent feathers gleaming in the soft light, remained calm and alert, as if it understood the importance of the mission it was about to undertake. Its small, bright eyes seemed to mentally map the route it would fly, a natural navigation system that science still does not fully understand. The training of these pigeons was a meticulous process that began at birth. Chicks were raised in specific lofts, developing an unbreakable bond with their place of origin. Gradually, they were taken to increasingly greater distances and released, always returning to their starting point. This homing instinct was so powerful that pigeons could find their way back even after being transported in sealed containers for hundreds of kilometers. The speed of these winged messengers was impressive for the time. A well-trained pigeon could fly at speeds of up to 80 kilometers per hour, covering distances that would take a land messenger days in a matter of hours. Flying in a straight line, ignoring terrestrial obstacles like rivers, mountains, or dense forests, they offered the most direct route possible between 2 points. It was like having access to an aerial highway, while everyone else was confined to winding, perilous trails. But nature imposed its own cruel limits. Birds of prey, falcons, eagles, and hawks were natural predators patrolling the skies for easy targets. A carrier pigeon bearing a vital message could be struck down in seconds by a hungry predator, taking with it information that might alter the course of a battle or save lives. Trainers developed techniques to reduce these risks, such as releasing multiple pigeons with the same message or choosing times when predators were less active. Weather posed even greater challenges. Violent storms could completely disorient pigeons, causing them to fly in circles until exhaustion or forcing them to land in unfamiliar territory where they became vulnerable. Strong winds could push the birds far off course, adding hours or even days to the journey. Dense fog erased the visual landmarks pigeons used for navigation, leaving them lost in a world without reference points. Payload capacity was severely limited. Messages had to be written on extremely thin paper or delicate parchment in minuscule script that tested the limits of the period's penmanship. Complex information had to be condensed into a few essential words, a process that often resulted in ambiguity or the loss of important nuance. It was like trying to explain a complex situation using only brief telegrams. Reliability, though superior to many land-based methods, was still subject to unpredictable failures. Pigeons could simply choose not to return, especially if they encountered abundant food sources or potential mates elsewhere. Some joined wild flocks, abandoning their mission altogether. Others might be captured by people who did not understand their importance, kept as pets, or killed for food. Intentional interception became a recognized military tactic. Enemies trained falcons specifically to hunt carrier pigeons, setting up aerial patrols along known routes. Skilled archers specialized in shooting down messenger birds, and nets were stretched at strategic points to capture pigeons alive and extract their messages. This spurred the development of more sophisticated ciphers and the use of decoy messages to confuse interceptors. Maintaining pigeon lofts required specialized knowledge and constant resources. The birds needed regular feeding, clean water, protection against terrestrial predators, and veterinary care when sick or injured. Diseases could spread rapidly through a loft, wiping out years of training in a matter of weeks. Parasites, shifts in climate, and even loud noises could affect the animal's behavior and effectiveness. Dependence on animal instincts introduced elements of unpredictability that could not be fully controlled. Unlike human messengers who could be instructed, motivated, or threatened, pigeons followed biological programming that did not always align with urgent human needs. A pigeon might decide to make an unscheduled stop to rest, adding critical hours to an urgent delivery. Today, when we complain about delayed notifications on our smartphones, we rarely consider that our ancestors relied on living creatures whose instincts and well-being determined the success of communication. They developed a patience and an understanding of nature that our digital age has lost. Has our instant communication disconnected us from the natural rhythms our ancestors once respected? As pigeons sliced through the skies with messages tied to their small legs, ground-based observers began to experiment with forms of communication that harnessed light itself as the messenger. Fire, which had warmed and protected humanity since the dawn of time, was about to become the basis of a system that would turn the speed of light into an ally of the human word. In the rugged mountains that rose like stone sentinels against the starry sky, points of light began to blink in deliberate sequences. It was the system of fire signaling, a network of watchtowers that turned light itself into language. Each controlled flame, each calculated pause, each flash from a polished mirror carried fragments of information across distances that seemed impossible to bridge. Fire, a primal and powerful element, had been domesticated to serve as the messenger of light speed. Building these signaling towers required meticulous planning and considerable resources. Each post had to be positioned on high points with an unobstructed line of sight to neighboring stations, often in remote, hard-to-reach locations. Construction materials had to be hauled up the mountains along dangerous trails, and each tower had to be constantly supplied with dry wood, fuel oil, and polished bronze mirrors. It was an impressive infrastructure that demanded continuous maintenance and dedicated personnel. Operators of these systems developed sophisticated codes that rivaled complex languages. Different combinations of flames, one long followed by two short, three quick bursts, followed by a pause, mirror flashes at specific angles, represented letters, words, or entire concepts. The ancient Greeks created a system in which different torch positions represented letters of the alphabet, enabling the transmission of complex messages. It was like a primitive version of Morse code, but using fire instead of electricity. The speed of this communication was revolutionary for its time. A message could traverse hundreds of kilometers in a matter of minutes, limited only by the speed of light and the time required for operators to interpret and relay the signals. During the day, polished mirrors reflected sunlight in coded flashes. At night, torches and bonfires traced luminous patterns against the darkness. It was the fastest communication available before the electrical age. But the reliance on perfect weather made the system frustratingly unreliable. Morning fog could render signals invisible that were perfectly clear on sunny days. Snowstorms wiped out visibility between stations entirely, cutting communications for days or weeks. Heavy rain extinguished bonfires and made it impossible to keep steady flames. Even strong winds could distort the flames, creating ambiguous signals that led to misinterpretations. The accuracy of signals depended entirely on the skill and vigilance of human operators. A moment's distraction, a misreading of an ambiguous signal, or simple fatigue after hours of constant watch could result in completely garbled messages. Imagine the pressure of knowing that a mistaken interpretation of a flash of light could lead troops into an ambush or trigger an unnecessary war. The responsibility was crushing. The limited amount of information that could be transmitted forced an extreme economy of words. Complex messages had to be condensed into pre-established codes, often reducing important communications to basic concepts like danger, all clear, assistance needed, or enemy sighted. Diplomatic nuances, tactical details, or technical information were impossible to convey through these systems. It was like trying to explain a complex philosophical concept using only emojis. Signal interception was relatively easy for any observer who knew the code. Unlike written messages that could be physically protected, light signals were visible to anyone with a line of sight to the towers. This led to increasingly complex codes and the practice of transmitting false information to confuse spies. Some civilizations created multiple signaling networks with different codes for different types of information. The constant maintenance required by the system was exhausting. Bonfires had to be kept burning continuously, especially during tense periods when urgent messages could arrive at any moment. Mirrors had to be polished regularly to maintain their reflective effectiveness. Fuel supplies had to be replenished constantly, a complex logistical task in remote mountain locations. During winter, operators faced brutal conditions, keeping watch in towers exposed to icy winds and storms. The dependence on direct line of sight created obvious strategic vulnerabilities. Enemies could disrupt an entire communication network simply by capturing or destroying a single tower in a critical position. Artificial smoke could be used to obscure signals at crucial moments. False towers could be built to transmit misleading information. It was a powerful system, but with clearly identifiable points of failure. Today, when our Wi-Fi connection drops, we feel as if we're cut off from the world. But imagine relying on perfect weather and alert human operators for vital communication. These ancient systems demanded coordination and dedication that our automated communication has eliminated. Have we lost something valuable when we remove the human element of constant vigilance and careful interpretation? As flames flickered on mountaintops and mirrors reflected messages across valleys, visionary inventors began to dream of even more sophisticated systems. The idea of using visible mechanical structures to transmit coded information was taking root, promising greater precision and complexity in long-distance communication. A mechanical revolution was about to transform simple towers into elaborate communication machines. In the late 18th century, an extraordinary vision began to take shape on the hills of France. Elegant, tall towers rose against the horizon, each crowned by a complex mechanical structure that looked like an articulated skeleton silhouetted against the sky. These were Claude Chapp's optical telegraphs, communication machines that transformed precise mechanical movements into coded language. Wooden moving arms operated by systems of pulleys and ropes danced in deliberate sequences, creating a mechanical ballet that carried information across impressive distances. Each tower was a masterpiece of engineering for its time. The main structure, built from weather-resistant wood and reinforced with iron, had to be tall enough to ensure visibility between stations, yet stable enough to withstand strong winds that could twist or break the signaling arms. The signaling mechanism consisted of a vertical mast with two movable arms that could be set at specific angles, creating 196 different combinations. It was like a three-dimensional alphabet written across the sky. The mechanical precision required was extraordinary. Each arm position had to be exact, since small variations could completely alter a message's meaning. Operators developed meticulous techniques to calibrate the mechanisms using angular measuring instruments and cross-checking systems. A slightly misaligned arm could turn a message of peace into a declaration of war, making mechanical maintenance a matter of national security. Operator training was intensive and specialized. They needed to memorize hundreds of positional combinations, operate the mechanisms with speed and precision, and maintain absolute concentration during hours of continuous work. They also had to perform basic equipment maintenance, adjust cables, stretched by weathering, and replace damaged parts. It was a profession that combined the skills of engineer, telegrapher, and craftsman. Transmission speed was impressive by the standards of the time. A message could travel from Paris to Lille, a distance of over 200 kilometers, in just 2 hours, a feat that would have taken days using conventional messengers. The French system eventually comprised more than 550 towers covering thousands of kilometers, creating the first truly national rapid communication network. It was like a mechanical internet, connecting distant cities through visual signals, but the reliance on perfect weather remained the system's Achilles heel. Dense fog could halt communication entirely for consecutive days, leaving whole regions of the country isolated. Snowstorms not only obscured visibility, but could physically damage delicate mechanisms, breaking arms or freezing pulley systems. Heavy rain created glare and distortions that made it difficult to distinguish the precise positions of the signaling arms. The constant maintenance the system required posed a monumental logistical challenge. Each tower needed regular inspections, mechanism lubrication, replacement of worn ropes, and repairs to weather-related damage. In winter, operators faced brutal conditions, climbing icy towers to make necessary adjustments. Wood exposed to the elements deteriorated quickly, demanding frequent and costly replacements. Vulnerability to sabotage was a constant concern. A single damaged tower could break an entire communication line, isolating entire regions. During periods of war or civil unrest, towers became obvious targets for groups intent on disrupting government communications. Protecting hundreds of towers spread across vast territories was practically impossible, creating points of weakness that enemies could easily exploit. While more complex codes allowed for greater precision, they also introduced new possibilities for error. Operators needed to consult extensive code books to interpret messages, a time-consuming process susceptible to translation mistakes. Codes could be updated or altered for security reasons, requiring retraining of operators across the network. A single misinterpretation could propagate false information throughout the entire system. The restriction to daytime communication was significant. Unlike fire signals that could operate at night, optical telegraphs depended entirely on natural light for visibility. This meant that during the long winter nights, especially at higher latitudes, the system was inoperable for 12 hours or more each day. Nighttime emergencies simply could not be communicated through the network. Construction and operating costs were astronomical. Each tower required substantial investment in materials, construction, and operational staff. The French system employed hundreds of full-time operators, along with maintenance crews and supervisors. For governments of the era, maintaining an optical telegraph network represented a significant share of the national budget. limiting access to this technology to the wealthiest nations. Today, when our mobile internet fails, we quickly switch to Wi-Fi or cellular data. But imagine relying on a single complex mechanical system for all rapid communication, knowing that a storm or a broken mechanism could completely isolate your region. These communication pioneers developed the first truly national information network, but they also discovered that greater sophistication often means greater vulnerability. How does our current reliance on complex digital systems compare to the challenges they faced? As mechanical arms danced against the sky, transmitting messages through precise movements, an even greater revolution was brewing in the laboratories and workshops of visionary inventors. The discovery that electricity could be controlled and directed through wires was about to transform the very nature of human communication, promising speed and reliability that would render all previous systems obsolete. The year was 1844, and at the Washington, D.C. railway station, a curious crowd gathered around a strange and fascinating device. Samuel Morse, his fingers trembling with nerves and anticipation, stood before a contraption that looked like a bizarre combination of electromagnets, copper wires, and a simple lever. The air was charged with electricity, both literally and figuratively, as he prepared to send the first official telegraphic message in history. The metallic click of the device echoed through the tense silence, transmitting across copper wires the message that would forever change human communication. What hath God wrought? What God has wrought. Building the first telegraph lines was an undertaking that tested both engineering and human endurance. Teams of workers crossed wild territories carrying heavy wooden poles and enormous spools of copper wire. Each pole had to be sunk deep into the ground and aligned with millimetric precision to maintain proper wire tension. The work was brutal. Men sweated under the scorching summer sun and battled snowstorms in winter, always aware that a single alignment error could interrupt communication for kilometers. Copper wire, precious and expensive, stretched across varied landscapes like a metallic lifeline, connecting distant civilizations. But that lifeline was extraordinarily vulnerable. Storms toppled trees that dragged down the wires, causing outages that could take days to locate and repair. Lightning struck the lines with devastating force, not only cutting communications but often destroying costly equipment at terminal stations. It was like trying to hold a whispered conversation through a hurricane. Transmission quality depended on factors the pioneers of telegraphy barely understood. Electrical resistance increased with distance, causing signals to grow progressively weaker and more distorted. Moisture in the air affected conductivity, creating unpredictable variations in signal clarity. Electromagnetic interference from natural sources, distant storms, solar activity, even the aurora borealis, could transform clear messages into incomprehensible noise. Training telegraph operators became a specialized art that combined technical skill with extraordinary mental stamina. They had to master Morse code until it became a second language, able to translate instantly between thought and patterns of dots and dashes. More challenging still, they needed the ability to distinguish genuine signals from interference, interpret faint and distorted transmissions, and maintain absolute concentration during shifts that often stretched beyond 12 hours. The responsibility these operators carried was crushing. A misinterpreted message could result in disastrous business decisions, misguided military movements, or personal tragedies. They became guardians of vital information, working in small, isolated stations where the constant click of the telegraph was often the only human sound for miles. Loneliness and psychological pressure drove many to nervous exhaustion, a condition poorly understood at the time. Maintaining telegraph lines required near-heroic dedication. Repair crews would travel miles of line on foot or horseback, searching for breaks, loose connections, or damaged insulators. During winter storms, these men faced conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits, climbing icy poles in cutting winds to restore vital communications. Many died by electrocution or in accidents related to working at height. Vulnerability to sabotage became a significant military and commercial concern. During the American Civil War, both sides developed specific tactics to cut enemy telegraph lines while protecting their own. Cavalry units specializing in telegraphic warfare could isolate enemy command simply by severing a few strategic wires. This led to the development of redundant lines and protection systems, but it also revealed how reliance on physical infrastructure created strategic vulnerabilities. Construction and operating costs were monumental by the standards of the time. Copper was a precious metal, and the quantities required for transcontinental lines represented investments that only the wealthiest corporations or governments could finance. This created natural monopolies in which a single company controlled communications across vast regions, concentrating economic and political power in ways society was only beginning to learn how to regulate. International expansion of telegraph lines faced unique and extraordinary challenges. The first transatlantic telegraph cable, laid in 1858, functioned for only a few weeks before failing completely. Installation required specialized ships, primitive diving technology, and investments that ruined several companies. When a stable connection was finally established in 1866, it transformed international trade, but also demonstrated how global communication depended on extremely vulnerable physical infrastructure. Today, when we complain about a slow internet connection, we rarely consider that our ancestors celebrated when they managed to send a single sentence across a continent. They built the world's first electrical communication network using technology they barely understood, facing challenges that tested both engineering and human courage. Has our instant communication made us forget the value of the patience and persistence these pioneers demonstrated? As copper wires spread like metallic webs across continents, connecting distant cities through electrical pulses, a new discovery was about to free communication from the physical limitations of wires. The realization that invisible waves could carry information through the air was taking shape in the minds of visionary inventors, promising a revolution that would make communication without physical boundaries possible. On the eve of the 20th century, in an improvised laboratory in Italy, Guglielmo Marconi carefully adjusted a primitive antenna made of copper wires strung between wooden poles. The air around him seemed to vibrate with invisible possibilities, electromagnetic waves that could carry information through space without the need for physical wires. When the first radio signal crossed the Atlantic in 1901, carrying only 3 dots of Morse code representing the letter S, humanity witnessed the birth of an era in which voices and music could travel across entire oceans, invisible and intangible like electronic ghosts. The physics behind radio transmission was so complex that even its pioneers understood only fragments of the phenomenon they were manipulating. Electromagnetic waves traveled at the speed of light, bouncing off the ionosphere, being absorbed by mountains and reflected by bodies of water in ways that seemed almost magical. Wave propagation varied dramatically with the time of day, the seasons, and even solar activity, creating a powerful, yet frustratingly unpredictable means of communication. Building the first radio stations required massive, hazardous equipment. Primitive transmitters used electric sparks to generate radio waves, creating interference that spread across vast swaths of the electromagnetic spectrum. These machines consumed enormous amounts of electrical power and generated enough heat to make transmitter rooms nearly uninhabitable during the summer. Operators worked under conditions that combined the danger of electrocution with the discomfort of industrial furnaces. Reception quality depended on atmospheric factors no one could control or predict with precision. Electrical storms produced static that could make it impossible to distinguish signal from noise. Intense solar activity caused radio blackouts lasting hours or days, completely isolating regions that relied on wireless communication. Under certain atmospheric conditions, signals could travel extraordinary distances, allowing weak stations to be heard thousands of kilometers away, while at other times, powerful transmitters could barely reach the neighboring town. The development of affordable radio receivers transformed communication from a specialized professional process into a universal domestic experience. Families gathered around furniture-sized radio sets, carefully turning dials to tune in distant stations through the static. It was a nightly ritual in which voices from faraway places entered living rooms bringing news, music, and entertainment from a world that had previously felt inaccessible. But this democratization of communication also brought unexpected challenges. The electromagnetic spectrum, unlike physical wires that could be installed as needed, was a limited resource that had to be shared. Stations interfered with one another, creating an electronic cacophony in which multiple transmissions blended into incomprehensible noise. The need for government regulation became obvious, but the laws and international treaties required took decades to develop. The spread of information over radio was at once more democratic and more dangerous than any earlier medium. A single station could reach millions of listeners instantly, but that same capability could be used to disseminate propaganda, panic, or falsehoods on an unprecedented scale. The power to shape public opinion concentrated in the hands of those who controlled transmitters, creating new forms of political and social power. Maintaining radio equipment required specialized technical knowledge that few possessed. Vacuum tubes burned out regularly, antennas were damaged by storms, and complex circuits failed in ways that demanded careful diagnostics and costly replacement parts. Radio technicians became a new class of highly valued professionals, but their scarcity meant that remote stations often remained off the air for weeks while awaiting repairs. Interference between stations became a growing problem as more transmitters came online. Powerful stations could overpower weaker transmissions, creating dead zones where certain frequencies became unusable. At night, when atmospheric conditions favored long-distance propagation, the spectrum turned into an electronic battlefield where hundreds of stations competed for listeners' attention. Dependence on reliable electrical power created new vulnerabilities. Outages could silence entire stations, isolating communities that had grown dependent on radio communication. During emergencies, precisely when communication was most needed, electrical systems often failed first, leaving people without access to vital information. This led to the development of emergency power systems, but also highlighted how advanced technology could create dangerous dependencies. Today, when we lose cell signal for a few minutes, we feel immediate anxiety. But imagine living in an era when human voices traveling through the air were considered almost miraculous, even when they arrived distorted by static and interference. These radio pioneers created the first truly global form of mass communication, but they also discovered that reaching everyone meant anyone could interfere with the conversation. How does our current saturation of information compare with the wonder they felt upon hearing a distant voice emerge from the ether? As radio waves crossed oceans carrying human voices for the first time in history, inventors in laboratories around the world were working on an even more revolutionary technology. The possibility of transmitting not just code or music, but real-time conversations between people separated by vast distances was about to transform forever the intimate nature of human communication. The sound was at once familiar and impossible, a clear, recognizable human voice emerging from a device of wood and metal, carrying not just words, but intonations, emotions, and even the breath of someone who might be hundreds of kilometers away. Alexander Graham Bell, holding the first telephone to his ear, heard his assistant Thomas Watson speak the words that inaugurated a new era of human intimacy. "Mr. Bell, come here. I need you." It was 1876, and for the first time in history, two people could have a private, immediate conversation across distances that had previously required days of travel. The installation of the first telephone networks turned urban landscapes into forests of poles and wires. Each connection required a dedicated physical line, creating a complex web of cables that spread through cities like metallic veins. Telephone exchanges became the urban nerve centers where operators, almost always young women, manually connected each call by inserting plugs into enormous switchboards covered with jacks. The work was intense and precise. A single mistake could connect private conversations to strangers or disrupt vital commercial communications. The quality of the earliest telephone connections was often dreadful. Voices arrived distorted, mixed with background noise, echoes, and interference from other lines. Conversations were frequently interrupted by crossed lines, where multiple calls bled together into an incomprehensible cacophony. Users had to shout to be heard over long-distance connections, turning intimate conversations into public performances audible to anyone nearby. The cost of telephone calls made them a luxury accessible only to the more affluent. A long-distance call could cost the equivalent of a common worker's daily wage, limiting its use to emergencies or highly important business. This created a clear social divide between those with access to instant communication and those condemned to slower methods of written correspondence. Privacy, something we consider fundamental in modern communications, was practically non-existent in the early systems. Operators could, and often did, listen in on private conversations. Party lines in which multiple families shared the same physical connection meant neighbors could easily intercept others' calls. It was common for someone to pick up the receiver and discover they were listening to another person's conversation, creating awkward social situations and accidental leaks of sensitive information. Reliance on human operators introduced elements of fallibility and potential sabotage absent from automated systems. Operators might be ill, on strike, or simply overwhelmed during peak times. A bad-tempered operator could deliberately delay or disconnect calls. During emergencies, when call volumes spiked dramatically, the system often collapsed, leaving people isolated precisely when communication was most needed. Maintaining telephone infrastructure required armies of specialized technicians. Storms could bring down thousands of wires at once, causing outages that might take weeks to fully repair. In winter, ice accumulating on lines added enough weight to topple entire poles. Rodents gnawed through insulation, causing short circuits and unpredictable failures. It was a constant battle against the elements and natural deterioration. Expansion into rural areas presented nearly insurmountable economic challenges. The cost of installing telephone lines to isolated farms was often greater than the value of all the properties served. This created a primitive digital divide where rural communities remained cut off from the communications revolution for decades. Many remote areas did not receive telephone service until well after World War II. Telephone etiquette had to be invented from scratch. How do you begin a conversation with someone you cannot see? How do you end a call politely? What information is appropriate to discuss by telephone versus in person? Society had to develop new social codes for a form of communication that was simultaneously intimate and distant, private and potentially public. The social transformation wrought by the telephone was profound and often unexpected. Romantic relationships could be maintained across greater distances. Business could be conducted without face-to-face meetings. Medical emergencies could be communicated instantly. But new kinds of crime also emerged: prank calls, anonymous threats, and telephone fraud. Society had to adapt its laws and norms to deal with offenses that could be committed at a distance. Today, when a call drops or audio quality is poor, we immediately try again or switch to a video call. But imagine living in a time when simply hearing a distant person's voice was considered almost miraculous, even when it arrived distorted and mixed with noise. These pioneers of voice communication laid the foundations of our modern connectedness, but they also discovered that intimacy at a distance came with vulnerabilities and complexities we still face today. How does our current expectation of perfect communication compare with the gratitude they felt for any connection, no matter how imperfect? As human voices traveled through copper wires, connecting people separated by distances that had once seemed insurmountable, an even greater revolution was taking shape in research laboratories and in the minds of technological visionaries. The convergence of computers, telecommunications, and a global information network was about to transform not only how we communicate, but the very nature of human information itself. The world, a quiet revolution was transforming isolated computers into nodes of a global network that would connect all of humanity. Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN in 1989, typed the first lines of code that would create the World Wide Web, without imagining he was building the infrastructure for the greatest transformation in human communication since the invention of writing. When the first website was published in 1991, containing only simple text about the web project itself, few could have predicted that decades later, billions of people would carry in their pockets instant access to virtually all human knowledge. Building the modern internet required a physical infrastructure on an unprecedented scale. Fiber optic cables were laid along the ocean floor, carrying laser light beams that transported terabytes of information across intercontinental distances. These submarine cables, thinner than a garden hose yet bearing the weight of all global communication, were vulnerable to ship anchors, undersea earthquakes, and even shark attacks mistaking the cables for prey. A single rupture could isolate entire continents from the global network. The speed of digital communication fundamentally reshaped human expectations. Messages that once took weeks to cross oceans now arrived in milliseconds. But that speed created new forms of anxiety, the expectation of immediate replies, frustration at delays of mere seconds, and the constant pressure to be always available. Patience, a virtue cultivated by millennia of slow communication, began to seem obsolete in a world of instant gratification. The democratization of information brought extraordinary benefits but also unexpected challenges. Anyone with internet access could publish information for a global audience, bypassing traditional filters of editors, experts, and institutions. This allowed marginalized voices to be heard and specialized knowledge to be shared freely. At the same time, it created an environment in which misinformation, conspiracy theories, and propaganda could spread with the same speed and reach as verified information. Dependence on stable electrical power became critical in ways our ancestors never imagined. A power outage not only silenced phones and radios, but also cut off access to banks, navigation systems, medical records, and virtually every aspect of modern life. Solar storms, natural phenomena that once affected only compasses, now had the potential to cause communication blackouts capable of paralyzing entire civilizations. Digital security introduced entirely new vulnerabilities. Hackers could steal personal information from millions of people simultaneously. Governments could surveil private communications on an industrial scale, and cyber attacks could disable critical infrastructure without ever crossing physical borders. Warfare expanded into cyberspace, where battles were fought with code rather than weapons, yet with consequences potentially devastating in the physical world. Information overload became a real psychological problem. While our ancestors struggled with information scarcity, we face the opposite challenge: filtering relevant signals from an ocean of digital noise. Constant notifications, real-time updates, and endless content streams created a form of mental fatigue humanity had never experienced. The capacity for sustained attention, essential to deep thought, began to erode under the constant bombardment of digital stimuli. Privacy, a concept that evolved slowly over centuries, was redefined in a matter of decades. Corporations collected data on the behaviors, preferences, and movements of billions of people, creating profiles more detailed than any authoritarian government in history had ever compiled. Every click, every search, every movement was potentially monitored and analyzed, turning digital communication into a form of mass voluntary surveillance. The pace of technological change accelerated beyond humanity's capacity to adapt. Entire generations of communication technology became obsolete within a few years. Skills painstakingly learned became irrelevant almost overnight. Society struggled to develop ethical and legal norms for technologies evolving faster than our understanding of their implications. Global connectivity created an interdependence that was both empowering and vulnerable. Events in one corner of the world could have instant repercussions globally. Financial markets reacted in real time to news from anywhere. Pandemics spread not only physically but informationally, with panic and misinformation traveling faster than viruses. Humanity became a single global nervous system and inherited every vulnerability that connectivity implies. Today, when our internet connection slows for a few seconds, we feel immediate frustration. But imagine explaining to an 18th century messenger that we get irritated when a message takes 3 seconds instead of 1 to cross the planet. We have built the most powerful communication network in human history, yet we have also become dependent on it in ways our ancestors would have considered dangerous. Has our instant connectivity made us wiser or merely more impatient? And what would happen if this global network were to fail? At the end of this long journey through the millennia of human communication, we find ourselves in a moment of deep contemplation. From the first hands trembling in torchlight on the walls of Lascaux to the fingers that now glide across smartphone screens, humanity has traveled an extraordinary path of innovation, persistence, and adaptation. Each era brought its own wonders and challenges, its own triumphs and vulnerabilities, composing a complex mosaic of progress that has led us to today's hyper-connected world. The speed of communicative evolution is truly astonishing in perspective. Our ancestors spent thousands of years perfecting smoke signals and foot messengers, then centuries refining mounted mail systems and optical telegraphy. The electric telegraph dominated for decades, radio for generations, and the telephone for nearly a century. But the digital age has compressed multiple revolutions into a few decades, from dial-up internet to smartphones, from social networks to artificial intelligence, fundamentally transforming how we communicate in the blink of a historical eye. Each technological advance solved the specific problems of its time, yet invariably created new challenges for the next generation to face. Foot messengers removed the geographic limitations of face-to-face communication, but introduced vulnerabilities to weather and attack. Horses increased speed, but required complex infrastructure. Carrier pigeons offered direct aerial routes, but relied on unpredictable animal instincts. Each solution carried the seeds of its own limitations. The progressive democratization of communication is one of the most fascinating themes of this journey. What began as the privilege of kings and priests, the ability to send messages across great distances, gradually became available to merchants, then the middle class, and finally to virtually all of humanity. Today, a child with a smartphone has communicative capabilities that would surpass the most ambitious dreams of ancient emperors. Yet this democratization also brought responsibilities and challenges we are still learning to manage. The relationship between speed and quality in communication reveals striking patterns throughout history. Slower methods often allowed for greater reflection, accuracy, and depth. A carefully written letter carried a weight and deliberation that an instant message rarely possesses. The need to condense information for telegraphy forced clarity and economy of words. Our era of instant communication has gained speed and reach, but perhaps has lost something of the depth and consideration that slowness once compelled. Vulnerability has been a constant in every communication system, merely changing form as technology evolved. Ancient messengers faced predators and the elements. Modern systems face hackers and power failures. Each era developed its own forms of redundancy and protection, but also uncovered new kinds of fragility. The enduring lesson is that there is no perfectly secure or reliable communication system, only different types of risk that demand different kinds of preparedness. The human element has remained central even as technology has grown more sophisticated. Telegraph operators, telephone switchboards, radio technicians, and system administrators all represent the continuity of our need for human expertise to keep communication running. Even our most automated systems depend on people for design, maintenance, and troubleshooting. Technology amplifies human capabilities but rarely replaces them completely. Patience, a virtue cultivated by millennia of slow communication, faces unique challenges in our age of instant gratification. Our ancestors developed tolerance for uncertainty, the capacity to wait for information, and the ability to make decisions with incomplete data. Those skills, forged by necessity, may be more valuable today than ever as we navigate a world of information overload and constant change. The global interdependence created by our modern communication networks is simultaneously our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability. Never in human history have we been so connected, and never have we been so dependent on complex systems that few fully understand. The resilience our ancestors built through self-sufficiency and simpler systems may offer valuable lessons for building robustness in our digital age. Looking to the future, historical patterns suggest that our current digital era is not a final destination, but merely another chapter in an ongoing story of evolution. Just as our ancestors could not imagine smartphones when they invented the telegraph, we likely cannot envision how communication will evolve in the coming decades. What we can infer from the past is that each new technology will bring extraordinary benefits and unexpected challenges. The journey of human communication teaches us that progress is neither linear nor cost-free. Every advance demands adaptation, every solution creates new problems, and each generation must find its own balance between the possibilities of technology and the fundamental needs of human nature. Perhaps the most important lesson is that regardless of how we communicate, the human impulse to connect, share, and understand one another remains constant. It is only the methods that change. As we prepare to sleep tonight, carrying in our pockets more communicative power than entire civilizations once possessed, it is worth remembering the countless pioneers who made our modern connectivity possible. Every messenger who ran through storms, every operator who kept night watch, every inventor who dreamed the impossible, all contributed to the everyday miracle we now take for granted. Their struggles, sacrifices, and innovations echo in every message we send, every call we make, every connection we form. Communication, in all its forms throughout history, has always been about something more fundamental than technology. It is about the deep human need not to be alone, to share experiences, to build bridges across the distances that separate us. That need remains constant even as the methods evolve. And perhaps by understanding the extraordinary journey that brought us here, we can use our modern tools with greater wisdom, gratitude, and responsibility.